Hey, Kevin. Hey, how's it going?
Good. I'm just sorry, closing down my notifications here.
No, take your time.
Good, man. Good, good. How about yourself?
Good. Hey, thanks for taking the time to join me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. No problem at all. Did you get the books that I tossed in the mail, by the way?
I did. Yep, got them right here. In fact, yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It's really cool to get signed books from the authors. I'm an avid reader, so I really love having the physical copies of books.
Yeah, the Strangers that just the new whatchamacallit, the new afterword just got published, so it's cool to have something new. I went back and rode again with Grady.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was just, it's one of those things where it's like I'd been out for a while and people would ask all kinds of questions about, the job and what it's like, now versus then. And I was like, man, I can't really answer that question. And so one day I was like, you know what, I'm going to go back and do this. And
Oh,
so,
that's cool.
yeah, it was a crazy experience to be back out there.
Yeah, I've been debating the same thing. I've been out of EMS for about 5 years now. I work as an ERPA. I went to PA school while I was working as a full time paramedic, and so I need to do the same thing because I've been out for 5 years, and so I want to get back on the rig and see what it's like. Our system here in Colorado Springs sounds a little bit similar to yours. I think you guys had a lot more trauma in Atlanta from reading your books, but I mean, your stories resonate with a lot of our crews and what they're running here for sure. I mean, just the absolute crazy scenarios that you just can't make up.
No, man, there's a universal nature to the job that, I've had people, that's been one of the intriguing things. I've had people from like really small towns, um, you know, reach out and be like, oh God, I totally saw myself in your book, which initially I didn't think would be I mean, you do something like this and you just really wonder, like, is everybody just going to think this is ridiculous? And then not only do people relate to it, but everybody in EMS that's reached out, has been like, I see myself in this. And I think it's because there's just a universal nature to the job.
Mm.
The self-doubt that you have and the funny stuff, the crazy stuff. I think what most people don't relate to, at least certainly what I didn't, is the TV portrayal, which is like nobody dies before on my watch, none of that,
Yeah.
that bullshit never really rang true with me, but all the other stuff, um, and I've heard people say that the more specific you are in telling a story, the more universal it becomes, which seems like the opposite would be true. But ultimately, like if the closer you get to the human experience of whatever it was you did, the more people will see themselves in that experience. So
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, in my experience in PA school was your stories are very relatable to emergency medicine folks, but the rest of the medicine world does not understand the job at all. I would tell really overly specific stories in PA school, and people were just shocked. And like in the dark humor and the way we joke around, people did not understand that in the wider medicine community. So eventually I just kind of kept my mouth shut because the stories were way too shocking for people that had never been through it. There was an EMT in my program, and he could relate, but everybody else was just, they were like, I can't believe you're joking about this, or and you're like, well, it kind of helps us get through the day.
I know you've got it when you're sitting in an ambulance staring at the windshield in a rainstorm. The first 2 hours into 24 or 48 consecutive hours on the street, you're like, man, I need something to entertain myself with.
So you practiced from 2004 to 2013, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I went to school. I want to say went to EMT school. I think it started in like March of '03. Started in January of 14. I mean,
Okay.
of '04. Yeah.
And this was all mostly for Grady Hospital in Atlanta, at least when you were a paramedic, is that right?
Yeah, so it's actually spread. It's bigger now, but it used to be that the city of Atlanta proper was covered in its entirety by Grady EMS.
Okay.
And then AMR kind of came and went. Rural Metro came and went, and Grady has slowly been spreading out to other municipalities. There's some fire systems that transport. There are a couple of counties that do it that way, but largely it's Grady who shows up. Yeah.
Yeah, my
which I think is a
experience.
great way to do EMS. I mean, I have a lot of firefighter friends, and I think a lot of them, like it's a crazy job, firefighting, and it's a weird job, but it's also like not also inherently medicine. And, I've always wondered about like, why have we moved from hospital-based medicine? You wouldn't like put a cop in an ambulance. They're first responders too,
Right.
they're public safety too, but nobody would think of that. And I remember talking to a firefighter one time, and he said to me, he said, man, people come here because this job's manual labor. Like that's what we want to do. I don't want to find myself like doing, a drug drip. That's like, I didn't come here to do a lidocaine drip. And yet if I want to be promoted, I've got to get a paramedic license. And what is that? Like, that's not what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah, we have a similar kind of problem in Colorado Springs. It's all the fire department, they all run ALS rigs, so they have a paramedic on every engine. And then it's primarily private ambulance for the 911 system. And we run and butt heads, as paramedics do with the fire crews. But I feel like they're, at least the ones that go on to paramedic school, they do like the medicine. The fire stuff does seem to come first, but I find that they do want to be paramedics, at least the ones that promote to paramedics. So that's nice, at least, is that they're trying to work on their medicine. It does interest them, but most of their training is still on the fire side and stuff. So we all inevitably butt heads and, deal with that stuff. My experience was about 5 years later than yours. I was on the ambulance from 2008 until about 2018. I kind of went part-time in PA school and then tried to kind of hold on to it, and then just eventually went full-time as a PA and just couldn't keep up with all the training on the ambulance and all the things, the protocols that inevitably change over time. And I just wasn't working enough to really keep up with all that stuff. So I ultimately quit. Although I still am certified as a paramedic just because it's easy to do as a PA, just use the same continuing education for both. But, and you also do some writing for TV and film.
Yeah.
What, any shows or movies or anything we'd recognize?
Well, yeah. So I was on the show Code Black, which was a CBS show, starred Rob Lowe. But most of what I've done, which is, like the weird nature of Hollywood, most of what I've done and been paid for over the years is stuff that the world will never see. Like there's so much that goes unproduced. It's very much like an iceberg theory where, the majority of this multi-billion-dollar industry, is all speculative, and somebody pays you to do something. I mean, I just spent 2 years on a project that ultimately the network that was paying us to write it was like, we're just not going to do it. So you're like, like it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Because you look back and you're like, well, what did I get out of that 2 years?
Right.
But at the same time, the checks are clearing, so you do it, and it's fun. The process itself is a good time, and writing is I don't know, it's kind of like I could not do it. I am like whatever it is that makes you a writer. Like that is what I am, and I could not do it. But it's a torturous enough process that like you have to really love the process because and it's basically like sitting in your room and by yourself and trying to make something like relatable and understandable and riveting and really good. And the bar is incredibly high because everybody has read and watched good stuff. So you can't just turn out trash. So it's got to be good. And, like everybody else, writers are filled with self-doubt and wondering like, oh man, there's no way this is, like that's the whole process is just sitting by yourself thinking, well, this sucks. And you keep at it until finally it doesn't suck. So it's a difficult process that you would never want to do unless you absolutely loved every minute of it, even as bad as it can be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fact that you're a writer really shows in your books because they're so well written and easy to read. I've read a few different EMS authors, and yours read very easy. I mean, you can tell that you have a writing background, and I've been writing a book myself, and I kind of wanted to pick your brain a little bit about kind of the publishing process. Did you go through professional publishing and find like what's the intermediary, a literary agent, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so that's. Literary agent is the hardest part. That's where I was stuck for the longest. So, if I come out of college, work as a reporter for a few years, leave, work on an ambulance for a while, and then tear my ACL on a ski trip and sort of start making my way back into the world of writing. And while I was on the ambulance, I was writing, but I was just sort of writing novels, trying to figure out like what my kind of writing looked like, basically. And also figure out like how to do it, because it's like anything else. The first time you sit down to do something, it's generally not that good. Your first day in an ambulance, like you were slow, you were in the way. Your partner was like, geez, this guy. You couldn't start an IV, you couldn't make your way around town. You didn't know when to hurry and when to relax. It's all something you have to learn. So I spent a few years doing that. And once I thought I was good enough, I started reaching out to literary agents. And that's the threshold where like, the masses that's the first door that the masses hit is the literary agent. And that is, that's the doorway to the world. And once you have an agent, publisher might not publish your book, but the supposition is, oh, this is a well-written book, that this book is worth, it might not be a book for me, but it's a book, it's a real thing. And so the bar to get a literary agent is really high, and everybody is trying to do that. So like you're competing not only with to complete a difficult task, but you're competing with every single human being who sits down and writes a book. And for the longest time, I was just reaching out to agents and just getting no's. And then I had been writing, 1,000 Naked Strangers was initially a blog. I started writing it because, I was telling stories everywhere you go. I mean, you know how it is everywhere you go, your friends want you to tell that crazy story. And two things happened. One, I noticed that the details were slipping. That I told a story and somebody was like, yeah, wait, hold on. You forgot the part with the guy and the thing and it was up his butt. And I was like, oh gosh, how did I forget that? But that's, reality is over time, it starts to fade. And that I also noticed that everybody wants to hear the same stories. I was like, why don't I just write down some of these things? So that's how it started, was just me telling some of these crazy stories, simply to sort of like appease my friends who always wanted me in a bar to entertain people. And eventually I realized like, oh, there's something here. Like there's, if you begin to fuse these things together, there's an arc of me as a human being, of arriving into this field, really not having an idea what I was doing in life and, in general, not knowing much about who I was, but knowing that there was something on the other end of this ambulance that was real. And I wanted to come as close to that as I could. And so that's, I could begin to see the journey from that person to the person I was toward the end of this career, which of course you begin to, your whole concept of what it means to be on an ambulance and to be in those moments completely shifts once you've been there. But when the arc of it started to come out, I said, all right, well, let me sit down and write a book. And so I did. I wrote 1,000 Naked Strangers as a memoir. And then my fear or my old nemesis of like trying to track down a literary agent came back as soon as I was done. And I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? And so I go to the library, or excuse me, I go to like Barnes and Noble. Borders was still open then, so I went to Borders. I went to every bookstore that was in driving distance of where I lived. And I walked into the memoir section and I just walked through from A to Z. And I picked up every book that was similar to mine. So any memoir that was not written by a celebrity, any book that was about somebody's life experience, and I just flipped to the back. And if you go to the acknowledgments page of almost any book, they thank their agent. And so I came up with this form letter that basically said, I just read X by Y, and I see you represent them, and I think their book is similar to mine. And then I just launched into what, a couple sentences of what 1,000 Naked Strangers was, and then a couple, like the first 4 pages. And that was my letter. And I sent out 20 of those every day. So, I mean, I collected hundreds and hundreds of names of literary agents, and I just sent out 20 a day. And a couple of weeks in, this was back when, everything was going by. Like some of it was, no, it was probably email at that point, 2013, 2014. They started coming back after a couple of weeks, and some of them were no's, some of them were like, hey, I'd like to see some more. And then I got a phone call. One of them was just a phone call. And it was the woman I wound up signing with. And she was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know where it goes, but like, I can't put it down. And to me, that's a good sign.
Yeah.
And so that's how I did it. But it was, a process of like understanding that everybody you reach out to is going to say no. And I've said that before to writers. Like I've spoken to writers groups, and I've said, like, expect every person, whatever book you just finished, hold that book in your hand and tell yourself, every agent I reach out to is going to say no to this book. And people give me these horrified looks, but you need to expect that it's going to fail, because the vast majority of it will. But you got to plow through that. If you know it's going to fail and you're waiting for it to fail, you won't be crushed when that first, like, perfect, quote unquote, perfect agent for you says no, because they're going to say no. Like the chances of being lucky enough that the first person's going to say yes are minuscule. William Faulkner was turned down like 93, 96 times. I'm pretty sure most of us are not going to be as good a writer as Faulkner. So he could be said no to 96 times. And who the hell am I not to be said no to 96 times, or even 97? So that was my take. And so that was how I got an agent and a reason I tell that story is because it's not impossible. It's just difficult. And your story, whatever it is you're writing, like, do you believe in it? Is it good? Have you worked really hard on it? Like, have you honed it to the finest point that it can possibly be? And if you have, then enter into the next phase just as aggressively. Like, expect it to be really difficult. Bear in mind, walk into a Barnes & Noble, man. There are a billion books inside any Barnes & Noble. Are you telling me that all those people are better writers than you are? Like that, I mean, I used to, like, once a week, I would walk in and just sit around and go, there's no way in hell all these people are that much better than me. And it's just like, the reason I did this was just because it's so daunting. It's such a mountain to climb, but like, you got to keep reminding yourself, otherwise, you get discouraged. And once you got an agent, then everything, that changes the world, because again, they might not sell your book. Sometimes books don't sell that first book that they signed you on, but the idea, like the relationship between agent and writer, is they believe in you. You shouldn't sign with someone who just goes, wow, this is a really crazy book idea, because that person is not going to be around for the long haul. You need to see someone who goes, man, your outlook on life is wild. Like, your writing is beautiful. I couldn't put this down. That's someone who's going to want to read every manuscript that comes across the wire from you. And, and I think she reached out to, I think the initial list of publishers was 12 or 13 long. Probably, I'm going to say 13 and make it up, because 13 is my lucky number. So she sends out the 13 and we get 12 no's. We were living in California, and I was across the country at a friend's wedding. And she called and was like, hey, look, the first 12 said no. So I'll just, I'll get the next list together, and then we'll get ready. But there's one more out there, but hey. And the next day she called and said, the editor at Scribner wants to talk to you. Do you have time? And it was like the next 12 hours were a whirlwind, because I went from that phone call to, them buying the book, which was, incredibly exciting and gratifying. But it's not magic. I'm not a genius. I'm not particularly lucky. This was an incredibly long process for me. Like I'm the farthest thing from an overnight success. I began writing regularly in 99. My book was bought in 2014. So like, that's 15 years of like fiddling and figuring myself out and determining who I was going to be. And then also like putting in the work, but it's a process of putting in the work. And anyone who's in the middle of it, at any stage of it, like, just don't give up. The biggest difference between the people who don't make it and the people who do, are the people who do never quit.
Well, that's really good information. I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is I think there are so few authors that have actually been in the field and have actually done the nitty gritty of, the daily life of EMS. And I think it's important for EMS folks to read these authors, both because it kind of normalizes our experience a little bit, and you realize there's other people that have lived through these situations, have been successful through these situations. They don't feel so isolated and so alone. And so that's why I think it's super important for EMS folks just to read EMS authors, and for us to tell our stories too, because I think it really makes the experience a little bit easier to deal with when you realize you're not the only one seeing this stuff and dealing with these scenarios. And so many of our colleagues in EMS just deal with these horrible coping strategies, and I think that writing is one of those strategies that can actually help you through it. I wanted to get into some of the details too of your books. So 1,000 Naked Strangers was published in 2016. And this is one of the best accountings of the whole EMT school process that I've ever read. And from becoming a new paramedic to an experienced paramedic, I love how you articulated all the specifics of it. It's so relatable for those of us that have been through the process. And I mean, from the specific stuff of like down to the details of having a patient pin, like we all typically do that, but you would never think that that's a common thing until I read it in your book. Like, we had a patient pin because I don't want my personal pin getting bloody and gross and having to wipe it down in between every single call. And there was another detail too. Oh, the fact that everyone says 2 beers when you ask them how much they drank. Like, these are universal things that you wouldn't even know until I read it in your book. And I'm like, everyone does that. And, we just don't realize that everybody deals with these exact same things. So you captured the details super, super well. Your description of EMT school and like constantly feeling behind, feeling unprepared, not really knowing what the job actually was, like forming cliques in EMT school, that all happened to me as well. I remember my little group of guys, we were like, are we covering the right stuff? Like, what does this job actually look like? I remember even like thinking I need to ask the instructor, like, are we covering enough stuff here? Because I feel very unprepared. What were your thoughts going through the EMT school process?
I felt that most people looked at it totally differently than I did. And, imposter syndrome is a term now. It didn't used to be a term. I feel like that's new. Like, kind of what you're getting at about me pointing out the details that people didn't see. I don't think I realized, and I don't think most of us realized, that everybody always feels like an imposter until someone came up with the term imposter syndrome. And then you're like, oh my God. Like, I remember very early in college, I was at a class, the teacher was not yet there. So everybody's just sort of sitting around, running their mouths off. And this one guy who was just, there are those people that you look at them and you're like, I don't know that dude, but he's cool. Like, that dude's got a hot girlfriend and he probably drives a badass car. And he just had that. And he also had that, like, he was cool in a way that that like the nicest people are, you know what I mean? Like, people that you just want to be around. And because he was like clearly the coolest guy in the room, but also probably like the most genuine dude. And he made this comment and I realized, like, oh my God, he's worried about the same thing I'm worried about, which means everybody's worried about the same thing I'm worried about. Like, oh my God. And it was such an eye-opening thing. And I wish I had realized that back in middle school. Maybe I wouldn't have been so self-conscious, but maybe then I wouldn't have been the sort of writer that I am. But that's how I was. I was incredibly self-conscious entering into EMT school because I felt like everybody else seemed to know what they were doing. And maybe they looked at me and thought, like, this guy seems to know what he's doing. I guess I better fake it. Because that's what I was doing. As I tell in the book, my only experience with an emergency was a bad one, and I did not react well. It was a terrible jet ski accident, and the guy was seriously, grievously injured. The sort of thing that we all see at work, but rarely see in our personal lives. I mean, this guy had half his face knocked off, and we were miles from shore. We're in the ocean. Like, it was the worst case scenario, and and of course I was young and I was totally sort of panicking, and I just got lucky in that there happened to be a boat passing by, and on that boat was a doctor, and he took over, and that stuck with me. I always remembered, like, man, if all hell breaks loose, you don't want me around. And so I enter into EMT school, post 9/11, feeling like I want to be part of something, and I witnessed some firefighters, being part of this rescue. And I thought, like, oh, that's something I could do. And I kind of entered into it almost like cavalierly. And then, of course, that first day I'm sitting there going, dude, there's no way I can do this. Like, what was I thinking? Why am I here? I just quit a job to do this. So that's how I felt the whole time. And, that exactly what you were describing of sitting around going, boy, I don't feel well prepared for this job at all. There was so little practical information that was conveyed. You know, you think of things that you're going to need on the job, things you're going to be able to know how to do. So often, that's not what they're teaching. It's you're going through all these different things, and I remember learning about like acid base. I mean, acid base and sodium potassium pump, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's not a sodium potassium pump on an ambulance. Like, how about, can we get back to the part where you showed me how to put on the traction splint? Because that seemed kind of tricky. Which it turns out is a really hard thing to do, because nobody breaks, like, long, skinny guys don't break their legs. Great big fat people in pouring rain break their legs. Like, that's who breaks a femur, or someone in a car accident, who also has a broken ankle. So you don't use a traction splint. But like, if you need a traction splint, it's always the worst case. And they're really difficult to put on. And I was like, man, I want a lot more time in the traction splint world. So that's how I felt the whole way through. It's like, there's no way I'm ready for this. There's no way I'm ready for this. And then I did my first ride along. I think the first one, we didn't even run a call. I was just in a firehouse, sort of staring at them as they all talked to each other and pretended I wasn't there. And then the first time that I did anything was at Grady. And, they're incredibly busy. And from the moment I stepped onto that ambulance, we just never stopped moving. And I looked at the two guys, and they were so in sync and so fast and so intuitive. They just seemed to know what to do. And they also knew what the other was going to do. The way good partners do. And I was just watching that thinking, if I don't know what I'm doing in class, like, I really don't know what I'm doing out here, because these guys have it together, and they're going to hate me when I get here, because I am totally useless. So that's how I felt going through school.
Yeah, I think just normalizing that experience. I think they all feel that way. I mean, I deal with EMT students fairly regularly in the ER now too, and they're just wide-eyed, and like, I think just knowing that that's normal and to expect to feel that way is important, because it's really, being an EMT and being a paramedic is so much field training. Like, the school gets you started, but man, it's learning to actually put it into practice that is where you actually learn. And I think that needs to be normalized, because people come out of EMT school and paramedic school thinking they should be ready to go, and you're just not. You're not until you've actually physically done the things on a real patient. And some of the people I've talked to, there's a lot more simulation-based training now in EMT school and paramedic school, which I think helps a ton, because it's much more practical. You're going through the steps, realizing how long everything takes to actually do on a patient. I think that has helped a lot of them be more well prepared as a result, versus when we went through, it was very different. The acid base balance and that kind of, I couldn't tell you about that stuff now, even as a PA, because I don't use it very often. It's stuff that just isn't that practical. It's good to know, but it's not a practical thing. And I think a focus on the practical stuff's more important.
Or at least to jump into it quickly, and then to say, by the way, like, this kind of respiration is going to lead to this, and it means this. Because that's really the important thing, is like a very slow or very rapid respiration, whether that makes you acidotic or alkalotic on an ambulance, are kind of, neither here nor there. But like, why is that thing happening? It's nice to know that's going on in the background, but the question of why it's happening, I think, is something you don't know in the beginning. And you sit there and you stare, and then you realize, like, you get a partner who's been around for a while, knows what they're doing, and she's kind of looking at you like, hey, we've been chill all day, and it's now time to no longer be chill. And you're like, oh, how did she know how to kick it into that new gear? It was because she immediately recognized. She didn't think like, oh, this guy's alkalotic. She thought, oh shit, that is not a respiratory rate I want to see.
Right.